Welcome to Unapologetically Sensitive, where you can learn, relate, laugh, and maybe even live a bolder, brighter life. I'm your host, Patricia Young. This is a weekly podcast where we explore the strengths we have because of our sensitivity and some of the challenges it poses as well. The information in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hey there. To the creatives, healers, sensitives, and deep thinkers, welcome. Really glad you're here today. I think you're going to really enjoy this episode. Today, we talk a lot about diagnosis and women with autism. Some of the questions that we look at is, why are so many more women who are assigned female at birth being diagnosed with autism? Is it a fad? People say you just watch TikTok and you think you're autistic. Is self-diagnosis valid? Are there any stats? Why haven't women and how autism shows up been included in the criteria? How does autism present differently for women? Why is there a gap between the written criteria and lived experience for those who are assigned female at birth? We talk about what are some of the social differences that might look like, what are some of the stimming and repetitive behaviors looks like someone if you're an internalizer, because I think we think about things like fascination with trains and hand flapping, and if you're a female and you internalize, those can look really different. And I didn't recognize that in myself. And I probably should have talked a little bit about, I just went through the diagnosis process. I had self-diagnosis autistic and still had doubt. My presentation is very different. There are places that I really didn't see prior to my assessment how pervasive my autistic traits are and how incredibly validating it was to go through the diagnostic process and how challenging it was. And maybe in the outro, I'll talk a little bit more about some of the things that went on for me. This is a two-part episode. This is going to be episode 212. Episode 214, Dr. Myszak and I get back on and we talk more about pathological demand avoidance or pervasive drive for autonomy. What does an assessment look like? What do you do after an assessment? And I share a little bit more personally in that episode. But some of the other things that we talk about in this episode are, does Dr. Myszak have thoughts about HSP versus autism? Does she think that HSP is a subtype of autism, or is there a profile of autism where deep thinking and deep feeling and high empathy are more present? And then we start talking about PDA. I think that there's so much more that we need to know. And the more we can talk about it and share information, the more people can figure out where they fall and what they want to believe in. I have an awareness that if you're an HSP, you may have tuned out by now and thought, I'm an HSP and I don't want to know about autism. And that's fine. I totally support that. I'm going to continue to say, I don't know how to straddle this fence between learning about my own autism, believing I was an HSP for years, really understanding the traits of HSP, and how do I continue to engage listeners who identify as HSP? And there are more people that are listening that are autistic. And now I'm making a lot of connections between my own autism. I was so afraid about getting an assessment because I clearly felt autistic and I believed I was PDA. But really my fear was, what if I pay for an assessment and the assessor doesn't see it? And that was one of the big deterrents of not getting a diagnosis. Self-diagnosis is totally valid. And if you identify as autistic, there's no requirement to get a diagnosis. But for me, it ended up being an incredibly validating experience, which you'll probably continue to hear about. But I think that's enough for now. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Jessica Myszak. Dr. Jessica Myszak is a Chicago area psychologist who specializes in autism assessment for both children and adults, doing both in-person and telehealth evaluations in many states across the U.S. She's developed a niche in less typical presentations of autism in women, high-masking adults, and pathological demand avoidance, PDA. She also provides educational content on TikTok about these topics. She's also the founder of the Autistic Support Network, a free private online community for members to share information and connect with other autistic adults. This is a really informative episode that I think you'll enjoy. And now, on to the show. Hey, Dr. Myszak, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. I am really excited about this conversation today. I think people want these answers, so let's just get going if we can.
Perfect.
Why are so many people assigned female at birth being diagnosed with autism now. Why are we seeing this?
Well, so autism looks very different in AFAB people. It looks very different in females, and most of the research has always been done on males. And so because of that, all of our education and our assessment tools are skewed towards recognizing autism in males. And this is finally changing, and more information is coming out about what autism looks like in females and in adults. But there's still a gap there. So there's still a lot of psychologists and neurologists who are relying on what they learned back in graduate school many, many years ago. And so there is a gap between the people who are following this updated information and those who are not. But what's really, really exciting is that we're at a place now where many of these people have a platform. And so they're sharing what their experiences are like. They're sharing information about their private lives online. And more people are seeing that, oh, I'm not alone. This thing that I've always kept private, this thing that I've maybe hid from other people because it seemed different from what other people were experiencing, is suddenly what somebody else is talking about. And I've had many clients who have shared that maybe somebody mentioned autism before, but no, I'm not Rain Man. No, I'm not Sheldon. Somebody brought it up. They said, no, I don't resonate with that. But suddenly, I think we're getting past the stereotypes, which is huge. And I think as more and more autistic bloggers and podcasters and authors and other social media creators are sharing their story, I think more and more people are getting exposed to new ideas and seeking this out.
Yeah. So you sort of answered this, and I have a feeling that the questions that I have prepared are going to feel redundant. So let's just put that out there to start out with. But is being autistic, if you're a woman, a fad? And what about people who are saying, well, you just watch TikTok and, do people want to be autistic?
So yeah, I've for sure heard this, and definitely being a creator on TikTok, I hear this all the time. And I will say, I think there are psychologists that feel this way, that feel, if you heard about this on TikTok, well, I'm not going to take you seriously. And to this point, I often will tell people, you may not want to mention TikTok if you are seeing a different psychologist who may not have a positive opinion. But no, this is not a fad. I think the vast majority of people who are seeking this out, who are looking for this, they've slipped through the cracks. They haven't been accurately diagnosed or even been looked at all. And I always laugh a little bit because if you're familiar with TikTok, the things you're seeing are related to the things that you're interested in. And so, somebody who is very, very unlikely to be neurodivergent is probably not seeing a ton of stuff about autism or ADHD. If you're seeing some of my videos, or if you're seeing some videos of many, many other autistic creators, well, that might be something to pay attention to.
Yeah. Is self-diagnosis valid? And if so, why?
So yes, I think it is notoriously hard to get a diagnosis. And I 100% feel that if a person doesn't have the resources to get an evaluation, and if they can better understand themselves and better meet their needs and understand how their brain works so they can accommodate that, I don't see how anybody could argue that. So as a psychologist, I do see many adults who have self-diagnosed already. So they've self-diagnosed for years and been doing a lot of this stuff that makes sense. But lots of times they either want that last piece of validation, or they are looking for some other type of external accommodation that requires documentation. And so I don't keep statistics for our practice, but I will say that many, many of the adults that do come in that have found autism, that have self-diagnosed, are correct. And I do think it's important to note that my colleague and I have educated ourselves. And so we do a lot of this. And so I do think for people like us who do a lot of these types of evaluations, I'd say that's probably pretty consistent. But I'd say across the board, again, some of these other psychologists who are going with what they learned 20, 30, 40 years ago in graduate school, that probably looks very, very different.
Right. Well, and I had self-diagnosed and still had imposter syndrome. And once you get a diagnosis, it's still very common I'm going to speak about AFAB, assigned female at birth, that I think we still go through this imposter syndrome. And sometimes we really feel autistic. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes after getting a diagnosis, like I was assessed, I think less than 2 weeks ago with my formal diagnosis, I'm seeing how much my autistic traits show up that I knew how to manage, but I'm just seeing it show up even more. So I just want to validate that experience, that wanting that validation. And then I had also asked the assessor, can I beat the test? Can I manipulate you? Because my presentation in some ways feels like I don't see a lot of it. It feels like I don't know if there are subtypes or phenotypes that look a little bit different. And even though I related to an awful lot of content and what I was researching about for years, I still had that doubt, because if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person, and we all show up so differently and have varying strengths and areas that we struggle with.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think, like you, I do think a lot of people that have self-diagnosed get maybe sometimes stuck in this period of that back and forth. I'm resonating with this. Oh, wait, not this. Wait, this. And can get really stuck in this sort of research cycle. And so I think, I've seen a lot of people who sort of need this last piece to be able to move forward and move into, okay, I'm going to talk about this, or I'm going to accommodate this now. I feel like I can move past this. Am I not? Because there's a lot of information out there. You can absolutely spend many, many hours doing a lot of research and kind of be in that same place.
Right. And I want to name that it really is a privilege if you're able to access somebody who can do an assessment for you. B, find somebody who's familiar with high masking, internalizing, if you're AFAB, late diagnosed, and to be able to afford it, because some places you can't get in for a year and the cost is just prohibitive. So I want to acknowledge that it is a privilege to be able to get a formal diagnosis. And I was really afraid. And I have a couple of therapists. We all started working with highly sensitive people, and then we learned we're autistic. And we all have talked about, we identify as being autistic, but what if we pay for an assessment and it doesn't come back indicating that we're autistic? That's a real fear, especially if you have a presentation that for yourself doesn't feel typical. There is no typical, but
yeah. No, absolutely. In my work with clients, I try to get that all up front, and then try to say, okay, if you are autistic, what does that mean? If you're not autistic, what does that mean? And there have been a handful of people over the years where I am sharing information that they're not autistic, and that's really hard for a person to hear.
Yeah.
But I also share that you can still self-diagnose. If you're making these accommodations and that's helping, you don't have to stop doing that. This is my opinion, and you could get a second opinion if you want it. I don't want to take away any tools that somebody has found, but I do think the value sometimes too. So there's been a number of people who've come in who, looking at autism, I'm sure I'm autistic. Well, sometimes we also find ADHD, or sometimes we also find OCD or PTSD, something that wasn't even necessarily on their radar.
Right.
And some of those other things, there's some pretty effective ways to treat those, or some therapies that can be really, really helpful. And so I do think that in those cases, that can be really, really nice information for a person to have that can sometimes dramatically improve their quality of life.
Sure. Okay. So I have to tell you what my autistic brain is thinking. That as soon as I heard you say people weren't diagnosed, I'm like, then I wouldn't want to get a diagnosis. And I'm only naming that because I think that for people that have brains that are wired like mine, hear that. And I want you to correct me if I'm wrong. I think that it's more common for people to be misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder. You can have co-occurring anxiety and depression, OCD, and it may just be a diagnosis of autism, and there may be comorbidities. And in my experience, I think that's more typical. And I would think that it's less typical that somebody would come to you and not have a diagnosis of autism and have something else. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen, but because my autistic brain latches on to the one thing that you said of they didn't get a diagnosis, and my brain said, like, forget it, I wouldn't want to get diagnosed. So just sharing my divergence with you.
And I 100% agree with you. I think, yes, I've seen many, many people who have been previously diagnosed with bipolar or borderline personality disorder. And I think for some people, even been on multiple medications, one thing leads to another. Suddenly we're treating all these side effects, and nothing has actually gotten better. And some of those, unless you're really sitting down with a psychologist, unless you're really working with somebody who is ready to look at you with a blank slate, some of those diagnoses can be really hard to change. Once it's on your record, it's on your record. And that's going to be what doctors see, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I'm not discounting medication in any way, but I was diagnosed with depression and anxiety and was on multiple meds for depression, not so many for anxiety. Never got a lot of relief, but if you're told that you're depressed and things aren't right, how do you know what it's like to not feel depressed? I'm no longer on medication. And now through the lens of autism, for me, because of my PDA, and we'll talk about this, I often go into freeze mode, which can look like depression. And I'm really clear that it is not depression, it's freeze mode. And my body just gets overwhelmed in this, I cocoon. And the reason why I'm so passionate about sharing this is if you're working with someone who is not knowledgeable about autism and PDA, it's very likely that you'll get misdiagnosed, put on medication as I was, and misinterpret things. And now I'm going through this lens of reevaluating. Was it anxiety? Was it depression? No, I think it was my PDA, and going into freeze mode very, very frequently. And also because I don't tend to have meltdowns, I have shutdowns. And we'll talk about this more as we go on. But I think this is so important to talk about so that we really understand our experience accurately after being told and internalizing lots of messages and labels about ourselves that, for me, were not true.
Yeah. Well, and to add to those that you're talking about, I think burnout and chronic fatigue, and now even long COVID, I think there's a lot of things that can sometimes look really similar. And as different medical providers sort of see through their own lens. And so sometimes what looks like one thing to somebody else might look like something completely different, and the treatment can really differ. And so it's tricky.
Right. And the ADHD aspect, which I'm not talking about. I'm so hyper focused on the autism right now, but really I am ADHD, and I can see where one wins over the other sometimes, but I want to try and stay on track. So why haven't women been included in the criteria? And can you give me some ideas of how autism might look different in women and what you're seeing in women versus what we stereotypically think about Rain Man and Sheldon, and talking about trains or things that are very boring or very traditional ways of stimming that women may not experience or may not even identify with?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, historically, what we know about autism is based on white males. And so, of course, the information we have doesn't really accurately measure a lot for women or non-binary folks or people of color. And I think it's important to recognize, so the first DSM was in 1952, and there's really only been a couple of revisions. Things do not happen quickly with the DSM. It wasn't even so long that homosexuality was considered a mental disorder in the DSM. You think about any major, government, schools, healthcare, stuff takes a really, really long time to make a change. And it's a handful of people who are making those decisions. And so do I think there's going to be major changes really soon? Probably not. I think that our information that is getting shared in a much more current way is going to be light years ahead of what's in this DSM for a long time. Mm-hmm. I think with females specifically and with AFAB, people are much, much more likely to mask. And there is a small statement about masking that's in the DSM criteria now, but you can almost blink and miss it. It's later in life, people might mask, but it is not just later in life. We see elementary school kids, we see certainly middle school, high school, and beyond, significant masking, which is camouflaging and hiding some of these characteristics that seem different than what other people are experiencing. So it's having a persona, playing a role, kind of knowing what the expectations are in a specific situation, blending in or copying, sort of people watching and imitating what other people are doing. I think because of how females are socialized, women are also much, much more likely to internalize stuff and to recognize, oh, okay, I guess I just got to work harder in this, and I just have to kind of put my head down and figure this out on my own and not tell people that this is so much harder. It's not a surprise that many women that are autistic are also have anxiety or depression. Mm-hmm. I think another thing you mentioned, trains, and with the boys who have done a lot of the traditional autism research, it's things like trains and ceiling fans and vacuum cleaners are kind of the big stereotype special interests. And for females, it can be different. It's things that many neurotypical girls like too, but it kind of goes beyond that. So things like horses or painting nails or reading is a really, really huge one. That, of course, reading is great. We love it when our kid reads. Well, they're reading all the time. And the most effective punishment is taking their books away. I mean, that's something that you don't hear with a lot of people, but I hear it with a lot of my clients.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, it's sort of digging into, okay, oh yeah, horses, just like everybody else. Oh, reality TV. Okay, great. Are you interested, or is this something that is spending, that you're taking a lot of time on and going kind of doing the next level research into some of these things that I often see with autistic clients.
Yeah. In talking with some of my friends who are therapists that are autistic and their kids are autistic, we're seeing sports is one of the things that we see. That if you have a kid that's really into sports, that's one of the ways. And for me, it's relationships. It makes me a great therapist because I'm fascinated with relationships.
Yeah.
I want to make sure, too, that we include queer and trans folks in the group that have not been included in the DSM criteria which is why we're emphasizing assigned female at birth, AFAB, because I think when you have, I'm going to say my belief is, and I'd like to hear your thought, I think that there is a sensitive phenotype. And especially if you're AFAB, then you are going to be much more inclined to be noticing all kinds of details in the environment. And you are going to pick up on social cues and what's expected and not. And for me, I'm a high internalizer. And I think that's part of the temperament, or I'm not sure what the word is, phenotype, the subtype that I have. I'm just learning language. So if I'm using words that are incorrect, please correct me, because I don't want to be spreading misinformation.
No, and I'm glad you made that point, because I think sometimes when I get going, I'll talk about females or women. And yes, I am absolutely talking about AFAB. And I do think there are some really big overlaps with a lot of the LGBTQ community. And yes, certainly do not want to have anybody feel left out or feel like that I'm not speaking to that.
Yeah, yeah. Can you talk about what some of the social differences might look like in somebody who's AFAB versus your traditional male? Because part of what I hear often is, I don't have social differences, I don't have repetitive behaviors, I can't be autistic. Because again, we have that very stereotypical male presentation. And so I'm wondering, can you give some examples? At least let's start with social differences that might show up in someone who's autistic.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the females that I see, or some of the AFAB clients that I see, many times they might be on the fringes of a social group. So they, they're there, but they never feel like they're truly a part. They're never sort of a central part of a social group, or they feel like they get invited to big things, but really never form these close relationships that other people seem to. Many people might have, one or two best friends throughout school. And, maybe it's the same best friends they made in kindergarten that they just stick to, or maybe it's a series of, intense friendships that might change over time. What's sometimes funny is that we'll have clients share that we lost touch for years and then we came back. They both got diagnosed with ADHD, or they both got diagnosed with autism. And so I do think that there's some level of, we can be ourselves around each other. And so that's something that's really apparent early on. And maybe you don't understand why, but sometimes there's not always the case, but frequently that is something that I've heard about.
Yeah. Is a preference for very, very small groups, or preferring to be one-on-one, something that you would see more often in AFAB than perhaps males?
Yes, I would say that's something that's really common. And sometimes it's even seeking out romantic relationships. So now I think for people kind of losing themselves in a variety of romantic relationships and sort of being what that person needs at the time. And unfortunately, sometimes that's getting into romantic relationships that may not be the healthiest and might be taken advantage of in some ways. I also have some clients who put on this very bubbly personality and might be the life of the party, might be sometimes relying on alcohol as they get older, because that sort of loosens them up and feel like they can tolerate a little bit more. Or people who, are always sort of canceling things at the last minute just because they far out think, okay, yeah, I can do this. And then as things approach, the anxiety wins out and they'll avoid things.
Yeah. For me, that can also be ADHD. Like my nighttime self has great ideas, but my morning self, not so much. That something does sound really appealing, and then the time comes and I just don't have the energy for it. But I think there's also a misnomer around, you can be autistic and still be social. And I think that we think of people that are autistic as not being social, not liking people. I think the overwhelm and the overstimulation can still factor into that. But we miss a lot of people. And it's interesting. I have twin boys when they were less than 3, I suspected that one was autistic, and I had them get developmental evaluations. One of them was very social. When we would go out and they were babies, this was a kid I would hand off because he was just a party unto himself, very social, very outgoing. The other one would lay on the top of the couch and just stare off into space, looked like he was solving the world's problems. Their developmental evals came back fine. Neither one were diagnosed. Now that I have my diagnosis and I'm looking at things, and I had him take a couple of assessments, online assessments. My social kid, I'm pretty sure, is autistic. And because they were both diagnosed with ADHD, and he had a lot of, I'm sure they were meltdowns. I just thought he couldn't emotionally regulate, and I didn't have the skills. But it's ironic that I thought my quiet kid was autistic. And as it turns out, it would not surprise me if my very social kid is the one that's autistic.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because, it sort of challenges those stereotypes that are definitely there.
Yeah. And they met their developmental milestones at 2 or 3. So again, where the criteria was, this was probably back in 2003. But now looking back, it's so clear to me to see so many of the markers for autism that are there that, we struggled. We just didn't know why we struggled.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I'm wondering too, with women, our special interests can be socially acceptable. So we may have groups of people that we hang out with because we have shared activities, and we don't go deep in those activities. So maybe if we have things about our temperament that are more quirky or a little harder to be around, don't show up because everybody in that group is engaging in the same activity, whether it's in depth or not. And they could all be neurotypicals. But I would suspect that that's another reason why women tend to fly under the radar. What do you think?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think some of the big safe havens I've heard a lot about tend to be band, or tend to be theater for many people, where, it's many of the kids that are attracted to those are just really, really into those topics. And so I think they can be really welcoming and really tolerant of just different people, that, okay, we're not all the same person, and that's okay. Even sports, I think, is another one too, where if you're a great basketball player, if you're a great cheerleader, that's fantastic. You're an asset to the team. We all have fun together. I think sometimes the team dynamics can be tricky.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What might some stimming and repetitive behaviors look like for someone who's an internalizer, or for women that, again, may go under the radar?
I think it's definitely important to note that stimming is not always obvious. So, the big obvious things that people think about are hand flapping or rocking or pacing. But many of the people that I worked with do very subtle things. So sometimes they'll, maybe tense certain body parts, or even wiggle their toes inside of their shoes. And so it's something that wouldn't be obvious to anybody else. Daydreaming is a really big one. Mm-hmm. Wanting to watch or read or listen to familiar things over and over is something that can be really calming. Or sometimes wanting, using weighted blankets or heavy blankets, or, wanting a dog to lay on your lap, having sort of that comfort in that way. Things like that, I think, that can be much, much less obvious to people can all be considered stimming.
Mm-hmm. What about things like hair twirling, or pursing your lips, or having your tongue against the roof of your mouth, or sucking on the inside of your cheeks? As we're talking, thumb and my forefinger are rubbing together quietly, and my toes are touching. I have fidget toys on my desk, but I put them aside when I'm recording, or doing cricket feet, where you rub your feet together.
Yes.
Or doing a figure 8 or a pattern with your fingers or your thumbs or on your clothes.
Absolutely.
Also forms of stimming.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. And watching shows on repeat is such a great way that we don't have that synaptic pruning that happens. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, that our brains just are super wired. So we are constantly taking in so much information and processing, that the nice thing about when we watch shows on repeat, or music, or reread books, is it's predictable. And so it gives our brain a chance to relax. I don't know if you've seen the show on Netflix, Extraordinary Attorney Woo.
I haven't. I've heard great things about it, and it's on my list.
She's quirky. She's very quirky, and her autism is very apparent. And I watched it the first time around before I even knew I was autistic, and I picked it up again, and now it's my comfort show because I'm just enjoying it. Of course, I have a whole different lens now when I'm watching it, but it's really interesting. And there's a movie, if you're in the UK, it's called A Kind of Spark. I cannot think of who the author is. It's on Netflix if you're in the UK, and she's a young adult author, and I just read the book, I don't know, one day over the weekend. And there are two autistic characters in it. And I think she does such a beautiful job illustrating what some forms of autism can look like and how difficult it can be to have teachers and people around you who don't get it, and how the bullying and the harassment and the misattunement shows that. I think we want to see ourselves represented.
Absolutely. No, I've read the book. I actually gave it to my daughter to read. I think it's fantastic. I didn't realize it was a show, so I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, I think it's either a movie or it's a series, and you can watch it in the UK, and Netflix UK has it. I haven't been able to find it here, but if you have BBC, you can access it. I can't yet. Okay. Do you have any thoughts about HSP versus autism? Do you want to go there?
I know it's a hot topic.
It's a very hot topic, and yes. I don't want to put you on the spot.
Yeah, so I have some thoughts, but I'm also not strongly tied to my thoughts because I do think this is an evolving area. And I think it's a little tricky because autism is a DSM-5 diagnosis and HSP is not. I mean, it's something that has been traditionally described. And as we learn more about it, is all the people she was looking at were autistic. And so I do think that there is a big subset of people who are autistic that meet a lot of this criteria, or that do, highly resonate with a lot of the highly sensitive information. Certainly not all autistic people. And there have been some people that I've met who really, really resonate with the highly sensitive piece that don't necessarily identify as having any social difficulties. And so that's kind of where, I don't think they completely overlap, but also I don't think they're completely something that you can compare as apples to apples.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. I do think that, again, this has been an area of autism that has traditionally not gotten a lot of attention because it's a lot of these late diagnosed people who have sort of navigated the world without a diagnosis. And so I'm, in a sense, really excited to see what comes of this, because I think there's more people who do fit this profile who are wanting to change the world and wanting to share. And so I think that there's more coming. And so I'm sort of leaving it there.
Yeah. I want to provide a little bit of clarification, and I don't know if you have this information. So I'm always like, oh, do I say this or not? But I just say things. My understanding is that Dr. Erin has, I think, 2 nephews that may be autistic. And I think she didn't understand autism originally, and she had a very stereotypical view. She had something on her website that's been removed. And what I know is because I went to a retreat in 2018 that Dr. Erin spoke at, and one of the women who's a therapist there was actually part of her initial study that Dr. Erin put flyers up all over town at the colleges and communities to interview people. So she didn't interview autistic people. She had cast a pretty wide net. And I suspect, I'm just making this up, that she had a certain thought in her mind that she was researching, and because the disciplines don't talk to each other, it's kind of like ADHD and autism. I think there's so much more overlap than we think, but because we don't have people that are looking at both of those and seeing how they connect and where they're more similar, I suspect that it's similar with HSP, that she had an idea. And at the time, back in the 90s, we did not know a lot about what autism in women looked like. And I think that Dr. Erin and the people that support HSP really are very firm in what they believe. And for me, identifying as HSP and now being autistic, that didn't work out as cleanly as I would have thought it would be. And I don't know how else to say it without being disrespectful or disenfranchising anybody. So I think I'm going to stop there unless you have something to say.
No, yeah. I mean, I think there is, because, the HSP has been around for a while. I do think there are some great tools and some resources and things that can be helpful for people, whether they're autistic or whether they're not. And so I think if that's something that is helpful, that's great. Yeah, I'll be interested to see. I think there are more profiles, more phenotypes that we don't have a lot of information because this is very, very new.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see just in terms of percentages, how many people do really identify that and are autistic. And I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah. Do you think that there's a subtype of autism or a profile where deep thinking and deep feeling and high empathy is more present than maybe other subtypes or phenotypes?
I absolutely do. I think, again, don't have research to back this up, don't have, numbers or anything like that. But I again, a lot of especially AFAB people who have gone late diagnosed are very, very high empathy and even just evident in thinking about pursuing an evaluation, have done so much research and so much writing and introspection that is just not what most people do. And so again, kind of the other big profile that I think we're going to talk about is PDA. I mean, it's often very different than the PDA profile, but of course there's some overlap there too. And so I'm not sure how cleanly we have these different profiles, aspects of autism that some people really, really experience that not everybody does.
Yeah. Is the deep thinking and the processing, can that be considered stimming and or repetitive behavior?
I mean, I think it could, because sometimes people will get stuck on that. And so, especially with some of the repetitive behavior, thinking over and over again.
Yeah. It's interesting. So I had a reaction when you said stuck. And again, like I'm really struggling because I feel like I don't want to say anything that seems like I'm questioning you or picking on your words, and knowing that stuff sticks with me and listeners, it may stick with them too. So I'm just feeling sensitive to that. I went paddling by myself the other day, and I haven't paddled alone for a while. And I was surprised that it was rage paddling. And I had forgotten that when I used to paddle alone, that was often the time when I would do some really deep processing, some thinking. I'd work through things that were bothering me. It wasn't intentional. It just happened. And there are some things that have been very painful that I've been going through. And I know my thinking is looping. I came home and told my husband, like, my thinking is looping. And like, it's going to loop until it doesn't loop anymore, because these were some things that around my autism, around how people responded. It's hurtful. Were they unskilled in what they said? Yes. Are these things that happen? Of course. And it's going to loop as long as it needs to loop. Is that being stuck? It probably is. And for me, I'm going to refer to it as looping. But we're going to do what we're going to do. And that's just how our brains work, because we have these, I think, sometimes very high expectations, sometimes unrealistic expectations. We can do it. Why can't everybody else? And I think that can create a lot of pain. And where I struggle the most with my autism, it's not in jobs and keeping jobs, it's with relationships. And so that's where I see it showing up.
You can totally call me out on anything I say.
Okay.
And I'm glad that you are, and that's something that clients, will say, like, I just get stuck on this thing. And so
yeah,
I'm not trying to put my own words to somebody else's experience, but I do think sometimes people feel like overthinking can sometimes get in the way of action.
Oh yeah, absolutely. People. And I'm very pedantic, but I'm very proud of it. So let's just establish that I'm very proud of being pedantic.
Perfect.
So let's talk a little bit about PDA. Can you say what the yucky term for PDA is and what we all prefer, and talk a little bit about how that shows up?
Absolutely. So yeah, it has the unfortunate name of Pathological Demand Avoidance, which for obvious reasons is not preferred for most people that meet this profile. Most PDAers do prefer the term persistent drive for autonomy. And I think that reflects what it is without sounding so terrible. So this is a subtype of autism. It is newer in the research. It is not in the DSM, but there's been more and more information coming out about this and people that identify. And so it's a subtype. It's challenging to recognize and diagnose, and also challenging for many PDAers to manage. It is autism, but it doesn't always look like autism. And what seems to work well for many autistic people doesn't necessarily work well for PDAers. And so it's really important to recognize, because I do a lot of PDA evaluations for kids. And if a child is diagnosed with autism, well, okay, these are the cookie cutter recommendations that we are going to make and do to help them be successful in school. And most of those do not work well for PDA at all. But PDA, it's a type of autism that goes along with significant anxiety. And this anxiety is triggered by demands, sometimes everyday demands, things like getting to school, brushing teeth, even going to a class or reading a book that the person is really, really excited about. And so oftentimes there's some extreme behavior. So there might be meltdowns or explosive behavior or avoidance of these demands in a variety of ways.
Yeah. The term I prefer is pervasive drive for autonomy, and things that challenge my sense of being in charge of me and my decisions is what can trigger me. I would love to have you talk a little bit about the Autistic Support Network that you have. And then maybe what we'll do is the other question we'll wait until the next interview that we do to talk about. Are you okay with that?
Yeah. That would be
Okay.
fine. Kind of my newest project this year was creating an autistic support network. And this is a free private forum just for autistic adults. And it's a chance for people to get information and ask questions and connect. And, this sort of came about because as I was doing so many adult evaluations, I was seeing a huge difference between adults who had other autistic adults in their lives and could talk about the stuff they were experiencing and not feel isolated. And then those who didn't have anybody and felt shame or felt discomfort sort of talking about this. And so, it's like, I know so many autistic people. I would love to connect you guys, And so this is a way for people to find one another. It's still a baby. It's only a couple months old. We're still sort of finding our groove in terms of some live events and some chat things and some other resource options and directories and things. But I think that it has a lot of potential. And so I'll definitely encourage people who are newly diagnosed or thinking about getting an evaluation. You don't have to have an official diagnosis. You can be self-diagnosed, absolutely, to be a part of this. It has a lot of potential and could be a really helpful resource for a lot of people.
And where would people go if they're interested in it?
Oh, yeah, that is important information. So, yeah, it's just autisticsupportnetwork.com. And when you go on for the first time, you have to sign up and answer a couple questions. Are you adult? Do you think you might be autistic? To gain access. But that's to protect the information that's on there and it doesn't show up in a Google search somewhere.
Sure. And all of Dr. Myszak's information is in the show notes. So if you want to connect with Dr. Myszak, with the Autistic Support Network, it's in the show notes also if you're driving and you weren't able to write that down. Is there anything else quickly before we go? Because I just didn't manage time the way that I wanted to. I knew we had a lot of content, so it's okay.
No worries.
Yeah.
No, I don't think not right now because I'm going to be back. So we'll cover it then.
Well, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Have a great day.
All right. You too.
Bye. Hey again. So I'm curious to know, what did you think? If you stayed, you must not be too pissed off. I really am so curious to know how this shift is affecting you, the listener. And I guess if you're still here, then you must not be too upset. And there's something that's interesting and curious in this. How much of that related to you? Is it exciting? Is it threatening? It's interesting. There are 4 of us that are therapists, that 3 of us are HS therapists that learned we're autistic. And we have this thread in a Marco Polo group. And the other night they were talking about driving, and the other 3 people really struggle with driving. And the underlying theme of my autism is competence. And I've had so many revelations around my autism that have been really challenging. It's been incredibly validating and very challenging. And I don't have a problem with driving. And when we had this thread going the other night, I just said, I can't listen because I can't feel like my competence around driving is going to be undone, because there are so many areas in my life previously that I felt like I navigated well. And then once I started, learning to be an HSP, I don't like crowds. Oh, it's okay. And then seeing all the things that don't work for me sensory wise, I really I am not in a place where I'm willing to lose my autonomy around driving. And so I'm wondering, did you hear things that are feeling like it's taking away a little bit of a veneer where you didn't recognize that, that could be something else? I don't know. I'm just always fascinated to know how you are hearing these things. If you are interested in working with me, I'm working with highly sensitive people. I'm working with autistics. My passion now, of course, is working with people that are suspecting they're autistic or newly diagnosed, really wanting to expand. I don't talk very much about my ADHD. I think it's just so integrated into who I am, but I'm actually ADHD, autistic and ADHD, with a PDA profile. If any of that resonates, you struggle with relationships, with work, with parenting, sensory issues, navigating the world, overwhelm, I get it. I would love to support you and see if we can't help you manage better and maybe even thrive. I think that's all I have to say. Remember, sensitivity. Oh, did I tell you how you can contact me? You can reach me at unapologeticallysensitive.com. You're welcome to send me any kind of email at unapologeticallysensitive@gmail.com. Remember, sensitivity is nothing to apologize for. It's how your brain is wired. No matter how you show up in the world, if you struggle with communication or learning or relationships or work or anything, you're okay. You've got strengths, you've got gifts to offer the world. Our brains are wired differently. We may have expectations and disappointments. We may struggle. We may feel lonely. We may struggle with friendships or work. Any of the ways that we struggle is really okay. People may not understand you. People may not get you. You may over-explain yourself. You may overshare. In my world, there's no such thing as TMI. But however you show up in the world and whatever's going on is really okay. And you can have support, and we don't have to be like everybody else. It's okay to be unique. It's okay to be out there, to love the things that we love, to appreciate the things that we love, to have a very strong sense of justice and what is right and the way things should be, and to talk about the things that we are really passionate about. I think that's it. Have a blessed day.